You already know how important a steady supply of uncontaminated fuel is for your engine. Now let's look at all the components involved in getting fuel to your engine. Your Skyhawk's fuel system, in addition to 2 wing tanks, has valves, pumps, drains, a strainer, and a very important system of vents. I sound like Ron Popeil. Let's begin our journey with the fuel tanks. Here. As you remember, there's 1 in each wing. We implied that venting was important, and it starts with both fuel caps. Here's a fuel cap right here turned upside down. They are each vented to the outside air. Both caps have a one-way flapper valve on the bottom here that lets air in but closes so air and fuel can't escape. Venting allows air into the tank as the fuel is used by the engine. If the tanks weren't vented, the fuel would stop flowing out of them because the pump wouldn't be able to overcome the low pressure created in the tank. There is another outside vent under the left wing which also vents the tanks. It's this J-shaped tube right here that points into the slipstream. In flight, ram air through that tube helps provide a positive pressure in the tanks. A one-way valve right here allows ambient air in and prevents fuel from sloshing out in turns. And since I make a lot of sloshy turns, I appreciate that. A bleed hole in this valve allows a path for fuel to expand and vent overboard. A line connects the 2 tanks at the top, and this keeps the pressure even in both tanks and also allows fuel to expand into the left one if needed and then flow overboard. Fuel will expand on a warm day, and if both tanks are full, you might see a small amount dripping from that J-shaped vent. This is one of the reasons why I try not to nap under the wing with my mouth open on hot days. There are drain valves or sumps at low points in the tanks. Since water and sediment are heavier than fuel, they settle to these low points in the tanks. And you remember that you've been draining these at the beginning of each flight to ensure that your engine will get clean fuel. The fuel flows by gravity from each tank into this fuel selector valve. This is where you select the left tank, the right tank, or both to feed the engine. Usually the selector valve is set to both. But if you had one tank with more fuel in it, you could select just that one tank until it balanced out with the other tank. Also, if you park on a slope, the fuel can run into the tank on the low side. Gravity again. If you turn the selector valve to left or right, this won't happen. From the selector valve, fuel flows into the reservoir tank. The reservoir tank is used for vapor return for the fuel system, and it holds about a half gallon of fuel. Now, there may be times when you want to turn off all the fuel to the engine. The fuel shutoff valve lets you do exactly that. Maybe there's a fire in the engine, or you're going to make a precautionary landing. You would want to keep fuel from getting to any of the hot parts of the engine and continuing or starting a fire. This valve can be used to isolate the fuel system from the engine so there is less chance of fire getting into the cabin. To help the fuel flow to the engine under normal flight conditions, there is an engine-driven fuel pump. Now, this fuel pump runs whenever the engine is running and feeds fuel to the fuel injection system. There is also an auxiliary pump, sometimes called an aux pump. Now, if you have an aux on board, don't get it confused. This is a different aux pump. If you have a yak on board, of course, you'd use your yak pump. This is used for priming, and if the engine-driven pump ever fails, you can use it in that case too. The auxiliary fuel pump is designed so that it will not affect your engine operation if it is left on accidentally. In fact, you could leave the aux pump on, except that it's not needed for normal operations, and you would be using up the life of your backup system. So for that reason, I don't recommend keeping it on all the time. Now, some pilots have a nasty habit of running a fuel tank completely dry before they switch tanks. That is not a very good idea because both the fuel pumps are designed to pump fuel a whole lot better than air. So you want to avoid getting air into the system. If you run the tank out of fuel, what will happen is that those pumps will let air into the fuel system and may cause vapor lock, which keeps fuel from getting to the engine. So keep an eye on your fuel quantity and do switch tanks before you run one completely out of fuel. Another place to catch any dirt or water in the system is the fuel strainer. This is the lowest point in the whole fuel system, and so it's the last place to catch anything before it gets to the engine. You drain the fuel strainer under the fuselage on your pre-flight, along with the drains for the fuel reservoir tank and the selector valve. To help you keep track of your fuel, there are two fuel gauges. These gauges are electrically operated, and if you lose all the electrical power in your airplane, they would read 0. This doesn't mean you're out of gas, just that the gauges are no longer working, and that's why it's a good idea to know how much fuel you start with before each flight and how long you can fly with the fuel that's on board. There is also a light on the annunciator panel that provides a warning when the fuel in either tank drops below about 5 gallons. The L low fuel indicator means that the left tank is low, and the low fuel R indicator means that the right is low. When you see L low fuel R, that means you should probably already be on the ground with a credit card in your hand. This annunciator will also light up, and the fuel gauge will fall below 0 if there is a wiring failure in the system. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're out of fuel, but it would be a good idea to land at the nearest suitable airport and have a mechanic repair the system. Finally, there is a fuel flow indicator that indicates whether you are getting fuel properly to your engine. When it's in the green arc, right here, it's operating normally. But if the indicator reads low and it's down in the bottom of this arc, it could mean that the engine-driven fuel pump isn't working. This would mean that you'd have to turn on the auxiliary fuel pump, or aux pump, to assist the engine. It could also mean that you were running out of fuel and it's time to switch to the other tank if you were running on only one tank. With a good understanding of how your fuel system works, you'll always be able to keep your engine supplied with good, clean fuel. And that'll keep your engine happy and the pilot happy as well. Here are a couple of final points about your fuel system. When you're done flying for the day, it's a good idea to fill the fuel tanks after the last flight. Why? Well, it's good operating procedure, and the reason for it is if the tanks are not full, there will be an airspace at the top of the tank, and the air may have a lot of water vapor in it. Well, when the air cools down at night, the water vapor will condense, and you will end up with liquid water in the fuel. And as you know, your engine doesn't run well on water. In fact, if you create an engine that does run well on water, let me know, because I'm one of your investors. Also, you always want to use the recommended fuel in your airplane. Your Skyhawk uses 100 low lead, which is blue, or 100 octane, which is green, and they're both aviation fuels. Don't use a lower octane fuel because it could cause detonation. And do not go to automotive gas. It isn't made under the same standards as aviation fuel, and it may also be a lower octane. If your car stops running because of the wrong gas, it's no problem. You pull over to the side of the road. But if your airplane engine stops running, things aren't quite as simple.